Richard Blackwood stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city below through sheets of relentless rain. At 52, he commanded a business empire worth $3 billion, built from nothing through sheer determination and ruthless business practices. The Blackwood Corporation owned hotels, restaurants, shopping centers, and apartment complexes across 12 states. His name appeared on Forbes lists and business magazines regularly, always accompanied by photos showing his cold, calculating stare. The storm had been raging for 3 days straight, flooding streets and forcing many businesses to close temporarily. Richard found the chaos oddly satisfying. Weather was one of the few things even he couldn't control, and watching the city struggle reminded him of his own early battles against impossible odds. Born in a trailer park to an alcoholic father and a mother who cleaned houses for wealthy families, Richard had clawed his way out of poverty with single-minded focus. His assistant knocked softly before entering. "Mr. Blackwood, the Henderson contract is ready for your signature. Also, your wife called about dinner tonight." Richard didn't turn from the window. "Cancel dinner. I'm working late. And send Henderson's lawyers back to negotiate. Their terms are unacceptable." Margaret, his assistant of 8 years, hesitated. "Sir, this is the 3rd time we've sent them back. They might walk away." "Then they weren't serious about wanting my money." Richard's voice carried the cold certainty that had intimidated countless business rivals. "If they walk, find me someone hungrier." After Margaret left, Richard returned to his papers, reviewing acquisition reports and profit projections. His company had grown every quarter for the past 15 years, and he intended to maintain that streak. Emotions were luxury items he couldn't afford. Sentiment had no place in business decisions. The Blackwood estate sat on 40 acres outside the city, surrounded by manicured gardens and protected by high walls with electronic gates. Richard employed a full staff: housekeepers, gardeners, cooks, security personnel, and a chauffeur. To him, they were overhead expenses, necessary but forgettable parts of running his household efficiently. Among his employees was Miguel Santos, a 43-year-old man from Guatemala who had worked as Richard's groundskeeper for 6 years. Miguel maintained the gardens, cleaned the pool area, and handled outdoor repairs around the property. He was quiet, reliable, and invisible, exactly how Richard preferred his staff to be. Miguel had come to America 15 years earlier with dreams of bringing his family north. His wife Maria and 2 children remained in their village, surviving on the money he sent home each month. He shared a small apartment with 3 other immigrant workers, sleeping on a mattress in the living room and saving every possible dollar for his family's future. Unlike Richard's other employees, Miguel never complained about long hours or difficult tasks. He arrived early, worked through breaks, and stayed late when needed. Richard had noticed this reliability but considered it simply what he paid for. Good employees did their jobs without drama or demands for attention. The morning of the 4th day brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the rain seemed heavier, driven by gusting winds that bent trees and rattled windows. Richard's chauffeur called in sick, claiming his car couldn't make it through the flooded roads near his neighborhood. 2 housekeepers also called out, stranded by the weather. Richard cursed under his breath as he read the messages. He had important meetings scheduled and couldn't afford to be trapped at home by something as mundane as rain. His wife Catherine was visiting her sister in California, leaving him alone in the vast house with reduced staff. By noon, Richard was pacing through his home office, frustrated by the delays the storm had caused to his business operations. Several construction projects had shut down, costing him thousands in daily penalties. A planned property inspection had been canceled, potentially delaying a major acquisition by weeks. Looking out toward the grounds, he noticed Miguel working despite the terrible weather. The man was clearing storm drains near the pool house, knee-deep in rushing water, his movements methodical and steady. Richard watched with grudging approval. At least one employee understood the meaning of dedication. The afternoon brought news that several roads leading to the estate had been declared impassable. Richard's cook called to explain she couldn't make it home to prepare dinner. His security guard was similarly stranded. Only Miguel remained on the property, along with Elena, an elderly housekeeper who lived in the servants' quarters. As evening approached, Richard found himself in the unusual position of having to fend for himself. His kitchen, despite being equipped with professional-grade appliances, might as well have been alien technology to him. He had eaten in five-star restaurants or had meals prepared by his cook for so many years that he barely remembered how to operate a microwave. Standing in his gourmet kitchen, surrounded by granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, Richard felt a strange vulnerability. The refrigerator contained ingredients that meant nothing to him. Vegetables, cuts of meat, exotic condiments his cook used to create elaborate meals. For the first time in decades, he was forced to confront a basic human need without employees to handle it for him. He eventually managed to heat a can of soup and make a sandwich. Eating alone at his massive dining room table under a crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's cars. The silence of the house felt oppressive. Usually he enjoyed solitude, viewing it as peaceful productivity time. Tonight, it felt different somehow. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and Richard found himself drawn to look outside. Security lights illuminated parts of the grounds, creating ghostly shadows through the downpour. He wondered absently if Miguel had finally gone home to his apartment in town. Around 8 o'clock, movement near the gardener's shed caught his attention. Through the rain, he could see a figure huddled under the small overhang by the tool storage building. Richard squinted through the glass, trying to identify who might still be on the property. It was Miguel, still in his work clothes, soaked through despite the minimal shelter. The man appeared to be eating something, holding what looked like a small container in his hands. Richard frowned, wondering why his groundskeeper hadn't left for home hours ago. Curiosity overrode his usual indifference to employee matters. Richard pulled on a raincoat and stepped outside, immediately hit by the full force of the storm. Wind-driven rain stung his face as he made his way across the courtyard toward the shed. His expensive Italian leather shoes squelched through puddles, and within seconds his clothes were soaked despite the raincoat. As he got closer, Richard could see Miguel more clearly. The man sat on an overturned bucket, his back pressed against the shed wall for whatever protection it offered. In his hands was a small plastic container, leftovers perhaps, or something simple he had prepared for himself. Miguel looked up in surprise as Richard approached, quickly standing and nearly dropping his food. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't expect... Is everything all right? Do you need something?" Richard found himself staring at his employee's meal. It appeared to be rice with some beans and a small piece of chicken, basic, simple food that contrasted sharply with the elaborate cuisine Richard took for granted. Miguel's clothes were completely soaked, his hair plastered to his head, yet he had been sitting calmly in the storm, eating his modest dinner as if nothing was wrong. "Why haven't you gone home?" Richard asked, having to raise his voice over the sound of rain hammering the shed roof. Miguel looked uncertain, as if unsure whether this was a trick question. "The roads, sir, they're flooded. My car, it's old and I don't think it would make it through the water. I called my roommate, and he said our street is flooded too. I thought it would be better to wait here until morning." Richard processed this information with growing realization. While he had been annoyed by staff calling in sick or stranded, Miguel had been trapped on the property with nowhere to go. The man had continued working throughout the day despite having no way home, and now he was eating his dinner in a storm rather than presuming to ask for shelter in the main house. "You've been working all day in this weather," Richard said, more statement than question. "Yes, sir. The drains needed clearing and there were some tree branches down. I wanted to make sure everything was safe." Miguel's voice carried no complaint or expectation of praise, just simple explanation. Richard stared at the man's food again. In that moment, he began to see something he had never noticed before. Here was an employee who had worked faithfully for 6 years, who stayed late and came early, who continued laboring in dangerous weather because it needed to be done. And Richard realized he knew almost nothing about Miguel as a person. "Do you have family?" Richard heard himself ask, the question surprising him as much as it did Miguel. "Yes, sir. My wife and 2 children. They're back home in Guatemala. I'm saving money to bring them here." Miguel's face softened when he mentioned his family, a warmth entering his voice despite the cold rain. Richard nodded slowly, processing this information. He had seen Miguel nearly every day for 6 years, had relied on his work to maintain the property Richard valued so highly, yet he had never considered that this man had dreams, struggles, and people he loved. Miguel wasn't just a function in Richard's household operation. He was a person with his own life, his own story. The rain continued pouring down, and Richard realized they were both getting soaked standing there. But somehow, he wasn't ready to walk away. Something about this moment, watching Miguel eat his simple meal in the storm, learning about his family waiting in another country, had created a crack in Richard's usual emotional armor. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Blackwood found himself genuinely curious about another person's experience. The questions that began forming in his mind weren't about business efficiency or employee productivity. They were about Miguel as a human being, about what his daily life was really like, about the dreams that kept him working in weather like this. Standing in that storm, watching his groundskeeper finish his modest dinner with quiet dignity, Richard felt something shifting inside him. It was subtle at first, like a distant tremor that might signal an earthquake. He didn't understand it yet, couldn't name what was happening, but the foundation of his carefully constructed indifference was beginning to show cracks. The conversation between them had lasted only a few minutes, but Richard sensed that something important had just occurred. As he looked at Miguel's weathered face, illuminated by the security lights through sheets of rain, Richard began to see not just an employee, but a man whose story was more complex and compelling than he had ever imagined. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Richard knew Miguel would be spending the night on the property, probably trying to sleep in the gardener's shed or his car. The thought bothered Richard in a way that surprised him. Never before had he concerned himself with his employees' personal comfort or circumstances. But as he stood there in the rain, watching Miguel carefully pack away his empty food container and prepare to find shelter for the night, Richard felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. The beginning of genuine human concern for someone other than himself. That realization would prove to be just the first of many revelations that would completely transform Richard Blackwood's understanding of his own life and the people around him. The storm outside was nothing compared to the emotional upheaval that was about to reshape everything he thought he knew about success, dignity, and what it truly means to be human. Richard stood frozen in the rain for several more minutes after his brief conversation with Miguel, water streaming down his face as conflicting thoughts battled in his mind. Everything he had built his life upon, the belief that success meant separation from others, that emotional distance was strength, that employees were simply resources to be managed, suddenly felt less certain. Walking back toward his house, Richard's expensive shoes slipping on the wet flagstones, he couldn't shake the image of Miguel eating his simple meal with such quiet dignity. The man had shown no self-pity, no resentment about being stranded, no expectation that his wealthy employer should concern himself with an employee's comfort. This absence of entitlement puzzled Richard, who was accustomed to people constantly wanting something from him. Inside his grand foyer, Richard peeled off his soaked raincoat and stood dripping on marble floors that had been imported from Italy. The contrast struck him forcefully. Here he was, surrounded by luxury beyond most people's dreams, while a man who had worked faithfully for him for 6 years was preparing to spend the night in a tool shed. Richard had always prided himself on logical thinking, on making decisions based purely on rational analysis. Emotion was weakness in his world. Sentiment was a luxury that led to poor choices. But as he climbed the stairs to his master bedroom, Richard found himself thinking not about quarterly reports or acquisition strategies, but about Miguel's mention of his family back in Guatemala. Sleep came fitfully that night. Richard lay in his king-sized bed, listening to rain against the windows, but his mind kept returning to that moment by the shed. He found himself wondering about Miguel's children, how old they were, what they looked like, whether they missed their father. These thoughts disturbed him because they served no practical purpose, yielded no business advantage, yet he couldn't dismiss them. Morning brought no relief from the storm, though it had lessened to a steady downpour rather than the violent deluge of the previous day. Richard's usual routine, coffee prepared by his cook, breakfast served in the sunroom while he reviewed financial reports, was disrupted by the absence of most of his staff. Standing in his kitchen again, attempting to operate the espresso machine, Richard found his thoughts drifting to Miguel. Had the man managed to stay dry? Did he have enough food? The questions annoyed Richard because they represented exactly the kind of unprofitable thinking he had trained himself to avoid. Around 9 o'clock, Richard saw Miguel emerge from the gardener's shed, stretching and rolling his shoulders as if working out stiffness from an uncomfortable night. Even from a distance, Richard could see that the man's clothes were wrinkled and probably still damp. Yet Miguel moved with purpose, beginning his daily routine of checking the grounds for storm damage as if sleeping in a shed was perfectly normal. Richard watched through his office window as Miguel methodically surveyed the property. The man's dedication was remarkable. Here he was, having spent the night in uncomfortable conditions, with no certainty about when he could return home, yet he was immediately focused on his responsibilities. Richard had employees who complained about minor inconveniences, who called in sick for trivial reasons, who constantly negotiated for better conditions. Miguel simply did what needed to be done. By noon, Richard had made an unusual decision. Instead of working in his office, he found himself following Miguel around the property, ostensibly to assess storm damage, but really to observe his groundskeeper more closely. This surveillance felt strange and unprecedented. Richard typically had no interest in the daily activities of his household staff. Miguel was clearing debris from around the pool house when Richard approached. "How did you sleep?" Richard asked, the question feeling awkward on his tongue. He rarely inquired about his employees' personal comfort. Miguel looked up from the pile of branches he was stacking. "Fine. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. The shed stayed mostly dry. I've slept in worse places." He said this matter-of-factly, without any hint that he expected sympathy or improved accommodations. "Worse places?" Richard found himself asking, genuinely curious. Miguel paused in his work, perhaps surprised by his employer's interest. "When I first came to America, I slept in a park for 3 weeks before I found work and could afford a room. Before that, back home, sometimes we slept outside during harvest season, following the work from farm to farm." Richard processed this information, trying to imagine sleeping in a park by choice, driven by hope rather than homelessness. His own path to success had been difficult, but he had always had shelter, had always known where his next meal would come from. Miguel's journey involved a level of risk and sacrifice that Richard was beginning to realize he had never fully understood. "Tell me about your family," Richard said, settling onto a nearby patio chair despite the light rain. This was completely unlike him. He never lingered to chat with employees, never showed personal interest in their lives. Miguel's face transformed when he spoke about his wife and children. Maria worked as a seamstress in their village, taking in work from a factory in the nearest city. Their daughter Carmen was 15 and dreamed of becoming a teacher. Their son Roberto was 12 and loved soccer, playing with a ball Miguel had bought with his first month's wages in America. "Carmen is very smart," Miguel said, his voice filled with pride. "She helps other children in the village with their schoolwork. When I bring them here, she will have opportunities to study, maybe go to university." Richard listened with growing fascination. Here was a man who worked 60-hour weeks maintaining someone else's property, who lived in a shared apartment and saved every possible dollar, who slept in tool sheds during storms, all to create opportunities for children thousands of miles away. The selflessness was both admirable and completely foreign to Richard's experience. "How long have they been waiting?" Richard asked. 6 years now. Immigration is complicated, expensive. But I'm getting closer. Another year, maybe 2, and I'll have enough saved for the lawyers, the fees, everything they need." Miguel's voice carried unshakable determination, despite the lengthy timeline. Richard found himself calculating in his head. The amount Miguel needed to bring his family north was probably less than Richard spent on wine in a month, certainly less than he had paid for the sculpture in his foyer. The disparity seemed suddenly absurd. "It doesn't bother you, being separated for so long?" Miguel was quiet for a moment, stacking branches with careful precision. "It bothers me every day. I miss watching my children grow up. I miss my wife's laugh, her cooking, the way she hums while she works. But this sacrifice, it gives them a future. In Guatemala, Carmen might never go to school beyond what our village offers. Roberto might spend his life working in fields for wages that barely buy food. Here, they can become anything they dream of." The simple nobility of this explanation hit Richard like a physical blow. Here was a man who had given up daily happiness with his family to secure their future opportunities. Richard, by contrast, had spent years accumulating wealth primarily to prove his own worth, to separate himself from his humble origins, to build walls between himself and the poverty he feared returning to. That afternoon, Richard did something unprecedented. He asked Elena, the elderly housekeeper, to prepare lunch for 2. When she looked puzzled, he explained that Miguel was stranded by the storm and should be fed properly. Elena's surprise was evident, but she quickly set about preparing a meal. Richard found Miguel repairing a section of fence damaged by falling branches. "Come inside. Elena is making lunch." Miguel looked shocked. "Sir, that's very kind, but I have food. I don't want to be any trouble." "You've been working in the rain for 2 days. Come eat a hot meal." Richard's tone brooked no argument, though inwardly he was surprised by his own insistence. Inside the house, Miguel seemed uncomfortable at first, clearly uncertain about the propriety of eating in his employer's dining room. Richard had never invited an employee to share a meal, had never considered that such an invitation might be meaningful to someone who usually ate alone with simple food. Elena served them soup, sandwiches, and hot coffee. Richard watched as Miguel savored each bite, clearly appreciating the warmth and flavor after days of cold, simple meals. The gratitude was genuine and understated. Miguel thanked Elena repeatedly, but didn't make a show of his appreciation. "Tell me about Guatemala," Richard said as they ate. "What's it like where you're from?" Miguel's eyes lit up as he described his village, the mountains that surrounded it, the coffee plants that grew on hillsides, the way mist rolled through valleys in the early morning. He talked about community festivals where everyone contributed food and music, about neighbors who helped each other during difficult times, about a pace of life that allowed for relationships and simple pleasures. Richard found himself envious of aspects of Miguel's description. His own life, for all its material success, lacked the community connection Miguel described. Richard's relationships were mostly transactional: business partnerships, social obligations, networking opportunities. When had he last experienced the kind of unconditional mutual support Miguel took for granted in his village? "Do you miss it?" Richard asked. "The community, the simplicity." "Every day. But I also know what poverty really means there. When crops fail, families go hungry. When someone gets sick, there's no money for medicine. Children who are brilliant in school stop learning because their families need them to work. I miss the life we had, but I want more than that life could give my children." The afternoon passed quickly as Miguel shared stories of his journey north, his early struggles in America, his gradual adaptation to a completely different culture. Richard found himself talking as well, sharing details of his own childhood poverty that he rarely discussed with anyone. Miguel listened without judgment, occasionally nodding with understanding that seemed to come from his own experience of hardship. As evening approached, the conversation turned to dreams and ambitions. Miguel spoke of his plans once his family arrived: finding a larger apartment, helping Carmen apply for colleges, coaching Roberto's soccer team if possible. His dreams were modest by Richard's standards, but filled with genuine anticipation for simple family happiness. "What about you, Mr. Blackwood? What do you dream about?" The question caught Richard off guard. When had anyone last asked him about his dreams rather than his goals? He realized that somewhere in his climb toward financial success, he had stopped dreaming and started only calculating. His objectives were all measurable: net worth, market share, company growth. But none of them actually excited him anymore. "I'm not sure," Richard admitted. "I used to dream about never being poor again, then about proving I could succeed. Now—" He paused, unable to articulate what drove him beyond habit and momentum. Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "Success can be a trap too, I think. When you have nothing, you dream of having something. But when you have everything, what do you dream of then?" The insight was simple, but profound. Richard had indeed trapped himself in a cycle of accumulation without purpose, achievement without satisfaction. His success had become both his identity and his prison, preventing him from experiencing the kind of genuine human connection that clearly sustained and motivated Miguel. That night, Richard made another unprecedented decision. He told Miguel that the guest bedroom was available, that there was no need to sleep in the shed again. Miguel initially protested, insisting he didn't want to impose, but Richard was firm in his invitation. As they prepared for bed, Richard found himself reflecting on the day's conversations. In 12 hours of casual interaction, he had learned more about genuine human motivation, about sacrifice and love and community, than he had absorbed in years of business dealings. Miguel had unwittingly become his teacher, showing him aspects of character and purpose that Richard's education had never addressed. Standing in his luxurious master bathroom, surrounded by marble and gold fixtures, Richard looked at his reflection and saw a man who had gained the whole world, but lost something essential along the way. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin figuring out what that missing piece might be and how he might reclaim it. The storm was finally beginning to weaken, but the upheaval in Richard's understanding of himself and his life was just beginning to gather strength. Miguel's quiet dignity, his unwavering commitment to family, his ability to find meaning in sacrifice. These qualities challenged everything Richard thought he knew about success, fulfillment, and what it truly meant to live a meaningful life. For the first time in decades, Richard Blackwood fell asleep thinking not about profit margins or acquisition targets, but about a man whose greatest wealth was his love for people thousands of miles away, and whose greatest strength was his willingness to sacrifice his own comfort for their future dreams. The morning of the third day dawned clear and bright, the storm finally exhausted. Richard woke to sunlight streaming through his bedroom windows and the unfamiliar sound of genuine laughter echoing from his kitchen. Following the sound downstairs, he discovered Miguel helping Elena prepare breakfast, the two of them sharing stories in Spanish while coffee brewed and bacon sizzled. The scene struck Richard powerfully. In all his years of employing household staff, he had never witnessed this kind of easy camaraderie among his employees. They typically worked in isolated efficiency, speaking only when necessary, maintaining the professional distance Richard preferred. But Miguel's natural warmth had somehow created a pocket of humanity in Richard's sterile household operation. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Miguel said, immediately straightening and adopting the formal demeanor Richard expected from staff. But Elena continued humming while she worked, her mood clearly lifted by the companionship. "Please sit down," Richard said, gesturing toward the breakfast table. "Both of you. Elena, you've been working alone here for 2 days. Join us for breakfast." Elena looked shocked by the invitation, glancing uncertainly between Richard and Miguel. In 8 years of employment, she had never been asked to sit at her employer's table. Miguel encouraged her in Spanish, and reluctantly she took a seat. As they ate together, Richard observed the easy respect and genuine affection between his two employees. They asked about each other's families, shared small jokes, offered help with tasks. Their interaction reminded Richard of Miguel's description of his village community, people caring for each other without calculation or expectation of return. After breakfast, Miguel prepared to assess the storm damage throughout the property. The roads were finally clear, and he could return home later that day. Richard surprised himself by feeling reluctant to see him go. These 3 days had provided more genuine human connection than Richard had experienced in years. "Miguel, before you begin, could we talk privately?" Richard led him to his office, the same room where he had made countless business decisions without considering their human impact. "I want to understand something," Richard began, struggling to articulate thoughts that felt foreign to him. "You've worked here 6 years, sending most of your wages home, living in shared housing, separated from your family. You never complain, never ask for raises or special treatment? Why?" Miguel considered the question carefully. "My father told me something when I was young. He said that how you do small things shows who you really are. If I do good work, if I treat people with respect, if I honor my commitments, then I can face myself in the mirror. The money is important for my family, yes, but who I am as a man is important too." Richard absorbed this philosophy, so different from his own approach to work and relationships. He had spent decades focused solely on outcomes, profit, growth, market dominance. The concept of work as character development, of daily choices as reflections of fundamental values, was revolutionary to him. "There's something I want to discuss with you," Richard said, making a decision that surprised him even as he voiced it. "I'm going to help you bring your family to America." Miguel's face went completely still. "Sir, What do you mean?" "The immigration costs, the legal fees, whatever it takes. I want to cover those expenses." Richard had calculated the amount during his restless night, less than he typically spent on a single business dinner, trivial compared to his monthly personal expenses. Miguel's eyes filled with tears, something Richard had never seen from the composed man. "Mr. Blackwood, I cannot accept such a gift. It's too much. I must earn this myself." Richard had anticipated this response. Miguel's pride and self-reliance were part of what made him exceptional. "Then we'll structure it as a loan. You can pay me back over time, at whatever pace works for your budget. But Miguel, your children are growing up without their father. They need you now, not in 2 years." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Miguel alternately overwhelmed by the offer and insistent that he couldn't accept such generosity. Finally, Richard proposed a compromise. The immigration costs would be an advance against future wages, allowing Miguel to maintain his dignity while accelerating his family's reunion. When Miguel finally accepted, his gratitude was so profound that Richard felt embarrassed by how little the money meant to him compared to how much it meant to Miguel. This realization crystallized something that had been building in his mind since the first night of the storm. Richard spent the following weeks in a state of continuous self-examination. Every aspect of his daily routine seemed to demand reassessment. His enormous house, maintained by people whose names he barely knew. His expensive meals eaten in solitude while his staff ate simple food in the kitchen. His social circle of other wealthy individuals who discussed their problems without acknowledging their extraordinary privilege. Miguel returned to work as usual, but something fundamental had shifted between them. They spoke regularly now, not just about property maintenance, but about their families, their experiences, their observations about life. Richard found these conversations more stimulating than most of his business meetings. 3 weeks after the storm, Richard received a call from his immigration lawyer confirming that Miguel's family's paperwork had been expedited and approved. Carmen, Maria, and Roberto would arrive in America within 60 days. When Richard shared this news with Miguel, the man actually embraced him, a spontaneous gesture of gratitude that broke completely through the employer-employee barrier. But Richard's transformation extended beyond his relationship with Miguel. He began learning the names of all his household staff, asking about their families, their aspirations, their challenges. He discovered that his housekeeper Elena sent money to her elderly mother in Mexico. His cook James was studying accounting at night school, dreaming of starting his own business. His security guard Thomas was a veteran struggling with medical bills from service-related injuries. Each story revealed layers of human complexity that Richard had been blind to for years. These weren't just workers performing functions in his household. They were people with hopes, fears, responsibilities, and dreams. Their daily presence in his life was an opportunity for connection that he had wasted through indifference and emotional distance. Richard began making changes. He increased wages across his household staff, established a fund to help with medical emergencies or family crises, and created opportunities for advancement within his various businesses. But more importantly, he changed how he interacted with everyone around him, seeing them as complete human beings rather than components in his personal and professional machinery. The changes weren't limited to his household. Richard found himself reconsidering many business practices that he had previously justified as simply necessary for competitiveness. He began looking at employee satisfaction surveys that he had previously ignored, reconsidering policies that prioritized efficiency over human dignity, questioning whether his company's culture reflected the values he wanted to embody. When Carmen, Maria, and Roberto arrived at the airport, Richard surprised Miguel by offering to drive them personally rather than sending a car service. Watching Miguel's reunion with his family after 6 years of separation was one of the most moving experiences of Richard's life. The tears, the laughter, the way 15-year-old Carmen had grown so tall, the way 12-year-old Roberto clung to his father, Richard understood for the first time the true cost of Miguel's sacrifice and the magnitude of what this reunion meant. Richard had arranged for the family to stay in one of his rental properties until they found permanent housing, but Miguel insisted on paying rent. They compromised on a token amount that preserved Miguel's dignity while ensuring his family had a safe, comfortable place to live during their transition to American life. Over the following months, Richard watched Carmen excel in her new school, quickly mastering English and achieving grades that confirmed her academic potential. Roberto joined a local soccer team and blossomed under his father's coaching and encouragement. Maria found work as a seamstress with a company that valued her skills and treated workers fairly. But it was Miguel's transformation that most surprised Richard. With his family united and his greatest worry resolved, Miguel's natural warmth and leadership abilities emerged more fully. Other household employees began coming to him for advice and support. He became an informal liaison between staff and management, helping Richard understand employee concerns and suggestions. Richard realized that he had discovered something more valuable than another business acquisition or investment opportunity. He had found a model for how to live with purpose beyond personal accumulation. Miguel's example showed him that true success wasn't measured in net worth, but in the positive impact one could have on others, the relationships one could build, the contributions one could make to community welfare. 6 months after the storm, Richard made a decision that surprised his business associates and family. He established the Blackwood Foundation, dedicating a significant portion of his wealth to helping immigrant families navigate the legal and financial challenges of reunification. Miguel became the foundation's first employee, using his experience and connections to identify families who could benefit from assistance. The foundation's work brought Richard into contact with dozens of stories similar to Miguel's. Parents separated from children, spouses divided by bureaucracy and economics, families willing to make enormous sacrifices for future opportunities. Each story reinforced Richard's growing understanding that wealth's true value lay not in what it could buy for oneself, but in what it could accomplish for others. Richard's marriage, which had been deteriorating for years due to his emotional unavailability and obsession with business success, also began to heal. Catherine noticed the changes in him immediately when she returned from visiting her sister. The man who had been cold and distracted was now present in their conversations, interested in her thoughts and feelings, capable of genuine intimacy. "It's like you're a different person," Catherine told him one evening as they shared dinner for the first time in months, rather than eating separately due to conflicting schedules. "What happened while I was away?" Richard told her about Miguel, about the storm, about the gradual realization that his pursuit of success had actually impoverished him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Catherine listened with growing amazement as her husband described discoveries about empathy, community, and purpose that seemed revolutionary coming from him. The changes in Richard's personality affected his business relationships as well. Partners and employees noticed that he listened more carefully, considered broader impacts of decisions, seemed genuinely interested in outcomes beyond profit margins. Some worried that he was becoming soft, less competitive, potentially vulnerable to more ruthless competitors. But Richard's business performance actually improved. Companies with engaged, satisfied employees performed better in every metric. Customers responded positively to improved service and ethical practices. Investors appreciated the stability that came from sustainable, human-centered business models. Richard discovered that treating people well wasn't just morally superior. It was also more profitable in the long term. 2 years after the storm, Richard attended Carmen's high school graduation. She had been accepted to 3 universities with scholarships, ultimately choosing to study engineering at a prestigious institution. In her valedictorian speech, she spoke about the courage of immigrants who sacrifice everything for their children's opportunities, thanking specifically the employers and community members who supported families like hers. Richard sat in the audience, watching this brilliant young woman whose potential had nearly been wasted in rural Guatemala, thinking about how small actions could have enormous consequences. His decision to help Miguel's family hadn't just changed their lives, it had transformed his own understanding of what a life well lived could look like. Miguel continued working for Richard, but their relationship had evolved far beyond employer and employee. They were friends, advisor, and counselor to each other, partners in the foundation's work. Miguel's wisdom about character, family, and community had become invaluable to Richard's continued personal growth. "Do you ever regret it?" Richard asked Miguel one afternoon as they worked together in the garden, Richard having discovered unexpected satisfaction in physical labor. "Leaving everything you knew, taking such enormous risks." Miguel paused in his pruning, considering the question seriously. "I regret the years apart from my family. I regret that my children had to grow up missing their father, but I don't regret the choice to come here, to work for something better. And Mr. Blackwood, I especially don't regret that storm that brought us together as friends." Richard smiled, understanding exactly what Miguel meant. That storm had been the catalyst for the most important transformation of his life. The man who had once measured success purely in financial terms now understood that his greatest achievements were the relationships he had built, the families he had helped reunite, the positive changes he had inspired in his businesses and community. The groundskeeper who had once been invisible to him had become his most influential teacher, showing him through quiet example what true dignity looked like, what genuine success meant, and how a life of service to others could be infinitely more fulfilling than a life focused solely on personal gain. Standing in his garden on a clear afternoon, working alongside a man he now considered family, Richard Blackwood understood that the real transformation hadn't happened during the storm itself. It had begun the moment he chose to see Miguel not as an employee, but as a fellow human being deserving of respect, curiosity, and care. That simple shift in perspective had changed everything, proving that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the smallest acts of human recognition and compassion.